Good day, everyone. My name is Marcus Dekenaar, and I'm co-chair of the Load Research Chapter. At this stage, I'd like to thank Barry McCall for helping us establish this link with EPRI, and here I paraphrase his words. Today's talk is about EPRI Program 173, Bulk System Renewable Integration, DER and Other Integration. EPRI has about 50 programs, and this is one. EPRI also have programs on energy storage, electric mobility, customer demand behavior, energy efficiency, demand response. These programs cover the entire value chain of electricity through generation, transmission, distribution, and consumption. We all know the world is becoming highly unpredictable. Taking COVID as an example, comparing load curves prior to COVID and now, they are very different. The drivers have changed. Also, renewables have had a major effect over the last few years. Electric vehicles and battery storage are also causing change in the shape of the curve over recent times. EPRI would like to collaborate with SAIEE branch here for common good to share knowledge and help each other develop better forecasting abilities for the future, better tools and better data, and all things to do with load shapes, load curves, demands, etc. This is the first in a series of talks, and Aidan Tuohy was kind enough to be the first EPRI presenter.
Aidan is a program manager at EPRI, dealing with bulk system integration and variable and distributed energy resources. He got his doctorate at University College of Dublin Electric Research Centre in 2009 and joined EPRI in 2010, now works for Grid Operations and Planning Group. Prior joining EPRI, Aidan worked with the International Energy Agency, that's IEA Grid Integration and Variable Renewables Project, and he's published many journal papers. Aidan is also the secretary of the IEEE Wind and Solar Coordinating Committee and chairs Energy Systems Integration Working Group on Operating Impacts and Market Design. He is also active in the IEA, IEC, and in CGRE. We should consider this as a process of unpacking. Hopefully there will be further drill downs in future. Thank you. Aidan, I hand over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. And the idea here is to really kind of talk a little bit about some of the stuff we're doing at EPRI, talk about some of the challenges we're addressing for this particular program to give you a sense of the types of things we do. And then I think in future, other colleagues of mine will also present on other topics. And certainly for the topics I present today, we're happy to come back and do deeper dives with a few of these topics if any of them strike your fancy and you think there's some interest in future discussions. Traditionally, EPRI was a US company, but in the last 15, 20 years, that's changed quite a bit. And recently, we've been doing a lot more across the world. Within our group, I sit in our operations and planning area. What we do in our area is everything from long-term planning down to real-time operations. We're focused on the transmission system side of things. So it's thinking about issues like resource adequacy. Do you have sufficient resources to meet your future needs? Down through transmission planning and into real-time operations. We have colleagues that do the distribution side of this as well, and work quite closely with them in the same group as ourselves. What we're doing when we're doing this research is developing new methods, new tools, software. Sometimes it's models, sometimes it's studies, and we put out reports. But really, all of it is trying to help individual utilities and system operators across the world try to do some of this work in a collaborative fashion where they'll come together and identify new research needs that we can then create some of the value for them and make sure they actually get to use it. So a big focus is on the transfer of the technology as well as just the research itself. So it's not just about publishing papers, but also actually about getting utilities and system operators to better understand some of the long-term and short-term needs and then helping them to apply some of the research. Won't spend too long kind of advertising EPRI stuff, really try and get into some of the technical challenges we look at in our program. When I think about variable and distributed resources, there's really three things we look at there that are key. One is that the variability and uncertainty, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. The fact that the output of these resources changes from across seconds, changes across minutes, hours, weeks, even years. That challenges how we plan and operate the system. we do need to be able to plan now for making sure you have the resource availability and the flexibility needed to manage that, as well as the operational time frame, kind of understanding what's happening in your forecast, your load forecast or renewable forecast, and how you use that to make decisions. The typical forecast errors are getting significantly higher when you net out the renewable generation, the fact that you've got a lot more uncertainty in your system. So it becomes more challenging to operate the system, but developing tools and methods to be able to better do that when you have high levels of wind and solar. They also have zero marginal cost. So the next megawatt of production, as the wind speed gets higher, it doesn't cost you anything more. There's a capital cost to it, obviously an investment cost that can be significant, but from an operating cost, it's zero, which for market design and for some of the operational issues, that can be challenging as well. At the same time, these do reduce emissions and have some significant benefits in that sense. They are inverter based, so the fact that they don't behave like traditional synchronous resources that we've operated for the last century or more means that we do have challenges interfacing them to the grid. The fact that they have power electronics, they're different. We have to model that. I'll talk a bit about the modeling that we've done, the transmission system modeling type efforts that we've done. They also have issues around displacing traditional sources of things like inertia and frequency response. That said, you can control these to provide some of these types of resources, so there is some benefits potentially as well that you can get from them. So again, understanding the costs and benefits of adding these types of resources. And then on the location side, those on the transmission system often are located where there's a good wind or solar resource that often isn't where the load is. So additional transmission is needed, and we need to be able to plan for that. And then many of them are distributed. They're out on the distribution system, either at customers behind the meter or smaller distribution connected directly to the distribution system itself. But that provides challenges for how we plan and operate. We haven't traditionally looked at distribution systems as active sources of energy and planning for that, as well as operating with less visibility that you would typically have of your large central station generation. So being able to do that, but then getting the services from these new distributed resources. And that can include wind and solar, but also batteries and other forms of distributed resource. Within our renewables integration program, then we addressed that with these two slides here that I'll talk a little bit more detail. From a planning and resource adequacy perspective, we've looked at developing methods and tools and guidelines for that, and understanding what the system flexibility needs are when you look out 10 years in the future, what the resource adequacy is. Can you count on the wind and solar, or how much can you count on the wind and solar to provide capacity to your system? We've been doing a lot of work that I'll get into a little bit more detail in a few slides on the generic modeling aspects, understanding how to represent these tools or these new resources in the system modeling tools, the transmission planning studies that we've traditionally done. Again, they're very different than traditional resources, so you do need to be able to model that. Obviously, the manufacturer, when they come to actually build a plant, will have a model of their plant, but if you're looking out further in time, you need generic models to build out to look at what the implications might be in your system. Increasingly, we're starting to see this push towards very high renewable penetration, which can imply regions of your network or times of the year when you might hit 100% inverter based. And so we've been recently doing some modeling analysis on that. I won't get into that in a lot of detail today, but there will be there are presentations and links that I can provide if folks are interested. And then on the weak grid issues, so the areas with low short circuit strength can often be places where there's a desire to put a lot of renewables on the system. The fact you don't have short circuit strength can mean that you get control interactions at the inverters between different wind and solar plants, and being able to understand that and screen for where that is so that you can tune the controls on the plant better and study it in a bit more detail than you might otherwise have studied it is an important screening tool that we've been developing and applying with utilities and system operators in the past few years. One of the other things when we think about renewables is the concept of hosting capacity. Those of you who've been thinking about this on the distribution side may have seen this even further back in time, but in the last few years, the concept in the transmission system is also starting to come into play, where it's the idea of looking at a portion of the network and understanding how much additional wind or solar or battery resource can be injected into that system without hitting various limits, and being able to develop an understanding of those hosting capacity limits. As I said earlier on, then the market side of things, it's significantly changes the electricity markets. They've been designed around fossil or thermal generation, maybe some hydro, where the prices and the way that things are incentivized is based on those types of resources. We're now moving to a very different type of resource, and incentivizing the right attributes on the system becomes quite important. So we have a lot of work going on in the market design area. Two other activities that we've got going on in the operations space up on the top left, being able to actually simulate the system so that you can examine new operating practices. It requires more advanced simulation tools. So we've been looking a lot at the ability to simulate the operations of the system. Traditionally, that's been done using what's called production cost tools. That's now moving to be more advanced, where maybe in the past you model these at an hourly resolution across the entire system. Now we're saying you need to model these at a higher resolution and look at how a system might operate every 5 minutes for a year to be able to understand some of the implications. And one of those implications is operating reserves. So traditionally we've carried enough reserve to manage an outage of a large generator and be able to manage the frequency deviations. With wind and solar, that can increase significantly, so you might need to add additional reserve to your system, and we've done some tool development there. Transmission planning, one of the things that you think about there when you do see now more renewables coming in is what level of renewables should I put in my cases? How much renewables should I assume is being dispatched at any given time? Increasing levels of risk on the system, where it's not just the typical peak and off-peak cases you might want to study. You might need to start studying more cases than that to be able to get a better sense. And so we've been looking at tools to better identify some of those events that you might want to study on the system and try and understand the risk, and then bring more of a consideration of probabilistic methods into the transmission planning process, where that's traditionally been done in a very deterministic way. Now starting to think through how you might do that considering risk. A lot of work at the bottom left around forecasting. Here I'm thinking more on the operational forecasting, not the long-term forecasting, but that's certainly something that we've started looking at as well, around how the load forecast changes. But on the operational side, understanding how distributed PV impacts on your forecast, and methods to what types of data do you need, what types of methodologies do you need to assess the impacts of distributed PV on your load forecast. We've demonstrated how you can use sky imagers, which are cameras that look up into the sky to be able to track solar movement and use that to improve the forecast on the system. And then on the bottom right, looking at the frequency response and trying to understand, do you have sufficient frequency response on your system and operating reserve. That's at a very high level. I can get into more detail as we get questions later on. I do want to just take a step back and look at what we've seen in places like the US and across the world in terms of experiences people are having. So this is from the US, a relatively recent update, where we've seen in each of the system operators, these are the big ISOs in the US, the market regions that are there. This is their record penetrations, at least from the public data, in terms of what's out there, and how much in any given hour they were able to reach. So if you look, for example, at Southwest Power Pool in the middle of the country here, it's not a very populous area. There's not a whole lot of population, but it spans a pretty large region. They get very high wind penetrations recently, up to over 70% of their demand is being met by wind. That's helped by the fact that they have transmission links to the other neighbouring regions, particularly on the east, so that they can ship some of that power out when there's very high wind. But they have been managing these very high penetrations and working with them to understand some of the implications there. Some of the ones in the east where there's more population have lower penetrations, that the resource isn't quite as good and the land is more expensive. So really a lot of it's in this Midwest. Texas gets very high penetrations. And Texas is not connected synchronously with the rest of the US, so it has to manage the frequency issues and other issues themselves. And California, I'm sure people have heard that California's got a lot of wind and solar PV as well, a lot because of state policy choices. When we think about that and look at what's happening in Europe and other places, we've tried to kind of categorize what are the checklists for the experiences so that we can be thinking about what things you need to be planning for before you get to higher penetrations. And we've categorized it in this kind of 0 to very high. Very few countries have 0 penetration at this point. Most people have some penetration of renewables. But at that point, the big things are around getting interconnection requirements right, getting the models in place, those types of issues. As you get to that kind of low few percent where probably most of the world is right now, you're thinking maybe up to about 10% annual penetration. You get some days with higher penetrations, but forecasting of the resource output, making sure you have active and reactive control across the resources is very important on the system. Then as you get into the kind of medium penetration, that's where some of the more leading countries are just kind of coming out of this area, but some of the folks like in Texas and California and other places, when you look across the world, they're at a relatively medium penetration. They need additional reserves, they need flexibility on the system, and there are different ways of getting that. Coordinating across regions, if you have the ability to interact with neighbours and within your own system, better understanding of what's happening, you can take advantage of some of the diversity of renewable resources. So when it's sunny in one region, it might be cloudy in another, or windy in one region, it might be sunny in another, and getting that diversity across so that you can share some of the balancing issues and share some of the challenges. That's when you also see this duck curve that California ISO has talked about, where they see this large reduction in demand in the middle of the day due to all the solar power coming on, and their shape of their load looks like a duck with a little start in the morning and then a peak in the evening. As we get to the higher penetrations, less and less countries are at these, but you see places like Ireland and Denmark, the UK now starting to hit some of these challenges where they have stability potentially challenges. They get challenges around inertia and whether they have sufficient amounts of frequency response on the system. The weak grid issues I mentioned earlier on around low short circuit become quite important at these instantaneous high penetrations. And then you probably are looking only at places like Denmark and Hawaii where the very high penetration is happening. And they have different ways of managing it. In Denmark, it's very much related to being able to share the burden with its neighbours across Europe. For Hawaii, there's a lot of challenges, and they're looking at large amounts of storage and other aspects, really hitting the demand side for some of the flexibility that they need, and being able to understand how demand side resources, whether it's water pumps or water heaters or air conditioning load or other types of demand response can help them get to those high penetrations. It's important, though, as well, that we plan for these issues well before we have to actually operate at these. So a lot of people are studying these types of issues over on the right, even though they might still be on the left-hand side of the figure. Another kind of big summary graph that I wanted to point out here. When we think about reliability on the system, and there's a lot going on in this table, don't expect folks to read the whole table, but what we've tried to do here is look at different types of reliability services. Some of these are defined services in the markets, but some are just typical services that you need, voltage and short circuit and various types of frequency and availability, black start. Each of these types of resources can provide reliability, but in different ways. So the synchronous traditional plants are probably the ones most used to providing these reliability services, and therefore there's a lot of green in this chart for those. We've traditionally got our reliability services from them. The inverter-based resources, wind and solar, and particularly the grid scale, the larger ones that are connected to the transmission grid, they can provide these, but they're still early in their maturity levels, they still need to be tested, they still need to be demonstrated, and potentially some of the economics needs to be worked out as well. They may need batteries added to the wind site or the solar site, for example. But they can provide a lot of these. They're less used to doing so. And then you can also get some of this from the demand side. The black is probably places where we don't know of anyone doing that right now. Nuclear can provide some flexibility in some countries, but not everywhere. So we made it black. But we do have this that we put out, and there's an EPRI ID here. If you go to EPRI.com, you can put this number into the search box, and this paper will come up. And you can download it. It's a publicly available paper. We are trying to update it soon with some of the recent experiences. This is important because it shows how you can get a reliable system by merging different types of technologies together. It's not one technology, it's a mix of them. But other factors also come into play, things like the economics, the emissions, various policies that countries might have. That's a very high level, and I realize that I don't have a whole lot of time left, so I'll skip through some of these other slides relatively quick, and I will provide them to you all so that you can ask questions and we can get into more detail on it, and maybe in a future discussion if that's of interest. When I think about the modelling and planning area, I talked about some of this already. We've been doing a lot of work around weak grid modelling, developing the dynamic models for systems, grid strength issues, as well as protection, how you model the protection in protection planning tools or protection analysis tools, and how protection settings are done. We've done a fair bit of that over the years. When we think about modeling challenges, one of the challenges is the fact that you've got, when you get these large PV or wind plants, you really typically have far more than just, it's not like a traditional generator where we've got one synchronous machine that you're connecting into the system that you can model. Here there's often many hundreds or thousands of different PV panels, and there may be, for example, with PV, you might have some array inverters so that there's a collector system. Being able to try and model that in one model for your transmission system becomes quite challenging. So what we've been doing a lot of work on with others here in North America and Europe and other places is better understanding how you aggregate these resources and how you can model them as a PV plant, which eventually goes from this kind of more complex PV plant up in the top left down to a far simpler model on the bottom right that does a pretty good job of representing the overall plant behavior for the types of things you want to study in these types of tools. It's not going to tell you every single last thing about the real detailed electromagnetic transient type analysis, but it will certainly help you for some of the positive sequence and understanding the power flow and the dynamic behavior after an event on the system, how the frequency and voltage, those types of things behave. So we commonly have been looking at these generic models to do simulation. For renewable energy models, there's two broad groups that are doing generic model development. One is here in the US, under the Western Electric Coordinating Council, WEC, or the Renewable Energy Modeling Task Force, have been developing models for quite a while now that EPRI's been playing a leading role in. NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, are also quite involved in this effort, and there's quite a few documents out there in public to talk about these models. The commercial tools, Power Factory, PSSC, and PSLF, that are probably the most common ones used across the world, all do have some version of these models in there. We've worked with them to do that. We've helped them validate those models in those commercial tools. So they are all in there. And there's a couple more slides. IEC is also developing models, and some of these are there as well. We've been involved in that, though less engaged. There's a little bit more detail in them. The way they think about things is that they really want to represent the physics, whereas what we were looking at is representing the behavior, looking at making sure you just line up the overall behavior. When we think about generic models compared to getting proprietary models from vendors, which if you're studying a specific wind plant interconnection, then certainly the proprietary model is the better one to do. But if we're doing more generic studies for the future, then the generic models do allow, so they are well validated. You don't have to worry about, is this model that definitely going to behave? It's understood. There's lots of public demonstrations of that. You can use it in different software platforms, the various commercial tools. They all behave consistently. There's a lot of generic, there's a lot of transparent documentation out there. that everyone can read, so everyone is on the same page with the models. It's particularly useful, as I said, when modeling the future on the system. There are limitations. Right now, they're only positive sequence, even though we are starting to look at developing generic models for other types of tools as well. They're mostly good for that stability studies, that 0.1 to 3 hertz. So if you really want to look at some of the control loop issues, you might need a different type of model, a more detailed PSCAD, EMTP type model. It does assume a kind of a constant wind speed and solar irradiation. That's not hugely important because over the time frames you typically look at these models, it's a few seconds, it's not minutes when the changes are going to be larger. The weak grid issues, we are developing models for a weak grid right now, but the typical generic models aren't as well associated with that, and definitely some of the more specialized studies that you wouldn't use these models. This gives an example, and there's a link up here that you can click on afterward. It's a public document around how you use these types of models for renewable energy studies. I'm going to skip through some of this just for the purposes of time, because I know we're getting towards the end and I want to get to one or two other topics, but there are some more details there around some of the kind of inverters and weak grids and different metrics people have been using for weak grid studies, and the grid strength assessment tool that we've been developing that allows you to study these with different types of commercial software tools. So you can screen for weak grid challenges and weak grid issues. And then if you do see some weak grid issues, you can use this generic red REGC_C model that does try and represent some of the issues before you might go to a more detailed study. So there's more details there, and a lot of this is publicly available if you search for these. Just want to skip to some of these other topics, though, around some of the inverter-based challenges. I mentioned earlier on the penetrations of renewables. So this is an example from Colorado, where over the year they were at about 20 to 25% penetration in 2015 to 2018 timeframe. But when you actually looked hour by hour, that meant there was periods when you had very high and very low penetration. So sometimes they were getting as high as 70%, and other times closer to zero. So the point there is that even though you might not have a very high penetration across the year, you will have time periods when there will be high penetration, and that can have issues around the fact that it's inverter-based resources. So the top left shows some study work we did back in about 7 or 8 years ago. The blue line is the base case, and we started adding wind power to the Western electric system in the US, Western interconnection, going from around 15% of output of load in that case up to 80% of load. And as you added more wind power, you saw the frequency response decline. So the nadir, the point which after an event on the system happens, the frequency drops to a nadir. You don't want that to go under your load shedding set point, or else you start seeing a lot of load shed. So the nadir was hitting at 60-70% penetration. The other lines on this figure are when we use the wind power controls, the power electronics, to mimic or provide some of the behaviour that you expect from traditional power plants, and we started looking at that and showing there's some benefits to that. This type of studies have been done in places like Ireland. Ireland was one of the first to hit as a single synchronous system. It was hitting over 50% penetration up to 10 years ago. They did some studies to try and understand what might the limits be, and you can see the kind of summary of the study up on the figure here. They showed that under about 50% instantaneous penetration, they didn't see stability challenges as being an issue. Between 50% and 75%, the study showed that they could be an issue, but that there was ways to address those by changing settings on either conventional plants or on wind plants, or by changing operating practices at the control center. So that's like the kind of region they're in now. They've limited the penetration right now to 65%, and I can show a figure if I have time here in a second. Over 75%, they don't believe under the kind of current way of operating the system, the current technologies, they can get there. They obviously are planning to go beyond 75% into the future, but that'll require additional technologies and additional operating practices that they currently don't have in place. One of the things they're trying to do to start getting into these higher penetrations is adding additional types of reserve. So traditionally they've had what's in the green and the red here. a primary reserve and secondary reserve. They've now added this really quick responding reserve called fast frequency response. So these are inverter-based resources that can respond extremely quickly. And they also are compensating synchronous resources on the system. So combined cycle generation, gas, steam turbines, those types of things, to make sure that they stay around. They're providing them some compensation in the market as well. And then they also are looking at these ramping reserves to look at longer term changes in renewable output on the system. ERCOT in Texas looking at something similar. They have seen a large amount of new transmission. They were at one point getting a lot of curtailment up in the panhandle area here, up in the kind of middle at the top of the state. That was caused by a limit in how much transmission there was, and there were some stability implications for that. So they built a lot more transmission and were able to reduce the curtailment of resources. They have now been looking more at inertia themselves, and they've examined this over many years and shown that as wind penetration is higher, the inertia on the system does go down. They've also found, though, that it doesn't go down far enough that it's actually a challenge right now. So they have monitors in their control room to flag to system operators if there is a challenge around inertia. They will certainly curtail renewables to address that, but they haven't actually hit that yet. So right now they're observing it. It's not something that's really limiting their operations. And there's others doing things as well. Australia has been one of the big ones. They recently issued a study talking about this. They've been looking at this in certain locations having enough inertia. The UK is been doing some things around this recently with the implications of COVID-19. Their demand has been reduced quite significantly because of various shutdowns. Their weekend demand is very low now, and they've actually had to pay nuclear power plants to reduce their output so that they have sufficient inertia on the system to manage the loss of a generator. And they're also going out trying to curtail distributed resources occasionally to provide these types of resources. We've done a lot more work in this topic, and you can again enter these numbers into the EPRI search bar. These are public reports, and there's also a YouTube video of a presentation we did last year on this topic that's about an hour long on inertia and frequency response. And then just a real last quick one. I'm going to skip a few of these slides here for purposes of time. This is the duck curve I was showing earlier on. This is actually from Japan, where the grey line is their traditional demand and their orange line is now what they're having to actually deal with. They do have various pump storage and other things to help them there. Let me just skip ahead to this last figure that I wanted to focus on. This is a recent week in Ireland earlier this month, and I mentioned that they've been hitting these 50% penetration targets
Sorry,
recently.
Sorry, Aidan, you have until 10 to 4, so you still have about 10 minutes.
Sorry, I thought it was only 3 or 4 minutes. Let me go back 1 or 2 questions, one or two slides there. Thanks, Thomas. Operating reserves then are important, and I'll talk about this in the context of Ireland in a minute. But when we think about these different operating reserves and how renewables are impacting those, what we've seen is that across each of these, there's some potential implications. So these are the different types of reserves, planning and operations that various systems will carry. They're called different things in different systems. You might be familiar with different terms, but we've tried to categorize them. And again, we have videos and other things that are available to talk through some more of this. But we categorize them as things that respond to a specific event. So the loss of a large generator is a contingency reserve, or you might even in the future have these very, very large wind and solar ramps. I don't know that anyone right now is carrying that type of reserve. They're carrying these flexibility reserves, but not these ramp reserves. But you might have these longer duration events where you try and tap into secondary and tertiary events. Contingency reserve, we don't see that changing necessarily because of wind and solar, though it becomes more important because some of the frequency issues, because you've made the system a lot lighter, you're taking off a lot of the inertia on the system. So contingency reserve and making sure you have properly sized that becomes quite important, as well as understanding the contribution of different resources. So batteries can provide this fast frequency response, which was Not something we've traditionally included, but now we've started having to add this type of new resource in. So places like Texas are incentivizing resources that can respond very fast on the system. They don't necessarily provide the traditional inertia, which we've never really needed to worry about. But now that we are worrying about some of these issues on inertia, we're trying to understand, can you use something like fast frequency response to replace that? And then the other non-event type reserves, these are the ones that manage the continuous supply-demand balancing. So traditionally, that's been like a frequency regulation, automatic generation control. You're correcting the control error on the system, the frequency deviations. We've seen in places like California, that's been increased quite significantly because of the increased variability and uncertainty. They've needed to go and increase their regulating reserve targets. And often now we've been working with them and others to set these in a more intelligent way. So, for example, in Hawaii, we've been working with them to forecast their reserve requirements based on your load forecast, your wind and your solar for tomorrow or for next week or for the next hour. And then looking historically at what's happened when you've had similar forecasts and try to understand how much reserves should you carry on the system. We've shown that you can save a lot of money while maintaining or even improving the reliability of the system. So you carry the reserves in a more dynamic fashion where you reduce them when the risk is low and you increase them when the risk is high. The most obvious example there is you don't need to carry reserves for solar during the night, but there's more nuance as well where you might not carry reserves for wind when you know the wind forecast is pretty steady, where if the wind is going to be variable, you might increase the amount of reserves, those types of things. And then flexibility reserve is really the same thing, except acts over a longer time frame. I mentioned Ireland asking for ramping reserves over many hours, but these types of longer reserves that are meant to make sure you have enough capacity when you get to real time are these types of flexibility reserves. So those are new and really been added to address the renewables issue. These are probably the newest of the ones that are out there. And again, they can be set in a more intelligent way than just the same amount every hour. Planning reserve doesn't change in terms of the need to make sure you have sufficient reserve margin on the system. What does change is how do those resources contribute to reserve margin? So wind and solar resources are good to provide energy. We've seen them now provide grid services, but they're not very good providers of capacity to the system. It depends on how well they line up with the load, but often they'll provide some capacity, but not anywhere near as a percentage of their installed capacity compared to other types of resources. So being able to understand that and address that's important. And there's also this flexible capacity issue that I'll talk about on the next slide. Voltage control reserves do need to be considered as well. We're starting to look at what the increased implications of increased renewables is there, around where the reserves are and how you carry them. And things like black start and short circuit are still services that are needing to be addressed too. When I say flexible capacity here, this is what I mean. Traditionally, we've built enough generation to meet load and then some more to address outages of generators and load uncertainty. We now have these other metrics as well, though. You might have enough capacity to meet demand, but you might not be able to ramp across the hour or within the hour. So there's kind of this flexible capacity that's needed that California now is requiring folks to have enough flexible capacity on their system. And that's why they're starting to do some of these types of studies. That all comes up with this topic of flexibility becoming more valuable and coming from lots of different places. So it's important not to try and think of flexibility as one particular source, but thinking about it from loads of different areas, whether it's how you operate the system can be more flexible by including forecasting, for example. Using the renewables themselves to provide some of these services, they can provide voltage and frequency support relatively easily. Some of the other pieces may require additional policy or cost implications. Using the load, using traditional flexible generation and transmission and storage can all help you provide flexibility. And then go back to this figure, the Irish graph earlier this month. So didn't show off exactly what I thought it would show off. The demand here is in the kind of, it's hard to see here because it doesn't seem to have come out properly on the graph, but it's the blue line that tends to be a little bit lower. So if you look here at the 4th of June, for example, 6.4, It's the one that's a bit lower in the day. And then the higher blued one is generation. I'm trying to fix this for the slides that I sent on, but that's the overall generation on the system. So that's including some export on HVDC interties. The thick green is the actual wind, and the light green is the forecasted wind. I mentioned earlier on that the instantaneous penetration that EirGrid, the system operator there, allow is capped right now at 65%. You can see that happening on the last day or two here, where the wind power forecast is quite high, but they've actually curtailed the wind because they can't allow it to get higher than that 65% number. So you can see this curtailment happening as the wind power output is not getting up to the same level as it would have otherwise gotten the forecast. It does also show that you get periods when you can reach these very high penetrations, but then earlier in the week, it's pretty much at zero. So you also have to be able to manage with your traditional generation dispatchable resources. So this does show some of the challenges here, where you can reach 35%, 40% across an entire week, but it can also be quite close to zero some of those days. And so there's quite a variety of operating conditions that they'll have to operate under on the system. So that's kind of where I wanted to finish. I realized there was a lot of information there, and I'm happy to dive into more detail and follow up discussions as needed. My email is on the first slide, and if anyone has questions, just let me know.
Thanks, Aidan, for a nice overview of quite a broad topic as well. Here in South Africa and in the audience, we've recently been involved in investigations to join together the South African power pool and the East African power pool. And interestingly, both of them have growing amounts of renewables in them. I guess Bruno and others in the audience can speak to that. Another item of interest is the modeling of renewables in South Africa. As you know, we are seeing greater and greater penetration of renewables. And it's interesting to me that we're not necessarily ready with proprietary or generic models for that type of generation. But certainly, we have transmission planners and so on that require that. And those people are also in the audience. So I'd like to open the floor to some questions now.
Monde, there's something here very interesting here, Aidan. The fast frequency response with the battery energy storage now seemingly starting to penetrate our grids. Do we have cases where the fast frequency response is being derived from BESS? Do you know of any cases, and do you have any reports that are showing those kind of case studies?
If you go back to these numbers here, if you search on the EPRI website, or we can provide the links as well, they do talk a little bit about some examples of that. So there are a couple of examples. The UK, though, has put in place they call an enhanced frequency response, which is very similar to fast frequency response. One of the bigger challenges with fast frequency response currently is just defining what it is. We've been doing some work with folks in Asia and other places to look at what that requirement might be on their system. So it really depends on what you need. But most of these batteries, and particularly batteries, but other types of resources can respond pretty quick, and it's really about doing the right settings. Trying to understand how many seconds need to pass before there's an event that then they respond, and what type of response they provide. In the UK, they actually realized that there was a need for this enhanced frequency response or fast frequency response. So they went out and procured these resources. Maybe the year before last, I think it was maybe a few £100 million. They went and got a few hundred megawatts of this type of resource, and they have observed this. So you might be familiar with the load shed event, or some people are calling it a blackout that happened in the UK the year before last. They had this, maybe it was last year, they had a wind plant trip and a conventional generator trip at around the same time, and they had to shed quite a bit of load, including some of the trains in and out of London. So it became quite a big story in the media. But during that event, this enhanced frequency response helped reduce the amount of challenges they had. It responded quite well. So they've been seeing that they've used that. It's talked about in some of these reports, and we have links to other experience as well. The other part that I mentioned there would be Australia. After some of the events that happened there with the South Australia splitting off, they had they went and asked, and Tesla have built their big battery there, but there's quite a few batteries out there they're using fast frequency response to respond to some of the requirements on the system, their frequency control, ancillary services on the system. So both of those are showing that value of the enhanced or fast frequency response that these resources can provide. In North America here, some of these are also being in place for places like Texas and California. The other thing that they also are doing is fast frequency regulation. So as well as the response directly after a fault on the system that your fast frequency response provides, these resources can also provide the frequency regulation, the second-to-second type steady state regulation, where it's not an event, it's to manage the normal deviations in load. And places like PJM, the PJM market provides significant payments to batteries. So there's a few hundred megawatts of batteries entered the PJM market to provide this type of service that's this very fast and accurate response to the system.
Yeah. Just a last question maybe from me. I see that these studies are quite data intensive. You probably I've seen some graphs here that you were showing. They look like an hourly resolution kind of data. Mm-hmm. So is there don't you use for example, don't you use representative models to just try and counter the problem of data intensity, because obviously that needs a strong computer to run, etc. Mm-hmm. So like making use of load models instead of the actual data that is representing that load.
Yeah, we do certainly. Yeah. We do that quite a bit. I mean, it really depends on the particular study. If you're worried about the hour-to-hour variability of wind and solar resources, and can you keep up with that with your conventional generation fleet, you probably do need to have a good representation of that. So you probably do want to model that on an hourly basis. But even within that, you might be able to simplify by using models of this type of resource rather than more detailed, the really detailed representation that you might otherwise use. And then for some of the kind of planning studies that we've been talking about with inertia and issues like that, it's certainly, we don't study every single last hour. You have to pick the hours that are most relevant to the system.
Okay, thank you. More questions?
So thank you so much for the presentation. My question is focused on the determination of the hosting capacity. So my work is kind of related to that. We use stochastic probabilistic approaches to determine the hosting capacity. So I have a few questions towards that. And the first one would be, when you speak about uncertainty and variability, what kind of models or what kind of modeling are you applying to cater for that in the calculation of hosting capacity? What I'm finding out in most published works is that sometimes authors are considering the variation, the time series variation of the renewable energy source, but not looking at the uncertainty within an interval. So what kind of models, probabilistic models, are you applying to capture the uncertainty? That could be, for example, when you're looking at customer loads, that could be a model reflecting the diversity of the load within a given interval. So that's the first question. Help me with that. Thanks.
Yes. So around uncertainty, we have an area of research looking at, we have two types of research we're doing on uncertainty. One is on the operations side, though, that I'm more familiar with, so I can talk more. We've been looking at how much operating reserve you should be carrying based on the probabilistic nature of the wind, solar, storage, load, from storage, wind, solar, and load. So we've characterized the stochastic nature of those by actually working with weather forecasting companies that do ensemble weather models, where they run multiple versions of the same weather model or run multiple models to try and understand the uncertainty inherent in those resources. Then we take that and generate scenarios. We do some scenario reduction. to get us to something where we can then input that into a model that tells you how much additional operating reserve should be carried to meet certain risk preferences. So you might have a risk preference to say 99th percentile or 95th percentile of risk, and we'll carry that. And we'll do that for different intervals within the interval, from one interval to the next, and from, say, one cycle to the next, day ahead to real time. So there's another... There's a lot of work we're doing around that probabilistic methods in the operations, and then they can also be applied in the planning time frame, using some of the commitment and dispatch tools to try and understand some of those.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Thanks. Thanks for that. And talking about scenario simulation, I guess you'd be using some form of stochastic method for the generation of scenarios. In our experience, that's usually attracts a lot of computational burden. I'd like to know that if you're using, for example, for the probabilistic load flow calculation, if you're using a numeric approach and then a numeric approach again for scenario generation, what kind of experience do you have in terms of the computational burden, and what computational power are you guys having to use in order to to meet that burden? Like, what kind of computers are we talking about here? I think Monde kind of touched on that as well, on the requirement of very fast computers for such calculations.
Yes. So on the computing side, we typically are using a server on our network. It's a good new computer, but it's not. I don't have the numbers in front of me here, but it's can certainly share that later on. It's not a supercomputer or anything. It's a decent sized computer. With the scenario piece, what we've really been focused on is really better methods for scenario reduction. So I'm not an expert on the scenario reduction aspects, but certainly some of the folks we work with at various universities, as well as in EPRI ourselves, are focused a lot on better understanding how to reduce some of these scenarios by looking at the actual underlying physical data and understanding the real pieces that are most important, as well as for some of these studies, you really are looking at extreme cases. You're not having to look at, it doesn't really matter what's happening on average. It's really what are the extreme events that are likely to happen that you really want to try and focus on. So that's where a lot of our focus has been.
Yeah. All right, cool. Thanks. My last question, if Monde, I can. I just want to ask on the scope for technical variables that you consider in the calculation of hosting capacity. Is it just voltage rise, voltage drop? What kind of technical variables do you consider in assessing the hosting capacity of a network?
Yeah. So for the transmission hosting capacity, distribution hosting capacity, we look at issues like you mentioned, voltage, protection, other things. For transmission hosting capacity, it's right now, it's only voltage limits and thermal limits. The thermal limits on the line as well. We are looking at potentially adding some stability constraints. And actually, I should say we also look at weak grid issues. If there's a weak grid area of the network, we won't be able to add as much wind and solar as well. So short circuit strength will be another one. But mostly ends up being a voltage limit or a thermal limit that we see on the system.
All right, cool. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Justice. Colleagues, any last question for Aidan?
Hi, Aidan. It's Vasu here. I just wanted to check, what are the typical size of renewable plants that you're seeing coming up?
Question. Significant variation. So depending on where in the world you're working and where you're looking, a lot of those coming on in Europe are smaller distributed type plants, everything from rooftop PV to 5 megawatt type plants. Here in the US, it really depends on a few things, that the specific reason for those being installed. So those that I mentioned in the middle of the country, Southwest Power Pool and ERCOT places, they tend to be larger plants. They're a few hundred megawatts. They're being built because there's good wind resource there or good solar resource there. We're starting to see some solar plants now get into that level as well. Places that are a bit more constrained on space, so places like North Carolina, it's the state in the US with the second highest amount of solar after California. But it's got a lot of smaller solar because the way they're incentives are set off, it makes sense for them to be under 10 megawatts. They get to take advantage of certain incentives, as well as the connection cost of the system. So they see a lot of smaller plants, less than 10 megawatts, that on aggregate end up being a large amount. Whereas in the middle of the country, we start seeing these very large plants. Then you say places like the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi, where there's 1,000 megawatt plus type solar plants being installed. So those vary quite significantly. The larger plants are the ones where they'll be able to be better used for things like fast frequency response. There's more visibility and control of those typically, but then there's a lot of these smaller plants coming in as well.
Okay, thanks, Aidan.
Sure.
Okay, so I think just my comment. Maybe I don't know if you would like to comment on it. Then Aidan, is that on our networks, you find that most of our networks are long radar lines that are quite weak,
Mm-hmm.
and then if you look at using these distributed resources, for example, and take advantage of reserves, take advantage of these resources and use them as reserves, especially the fast switching ones, then you start to experience problems. So I think that is one big sort of a distraction in terms of fully making use of these resources, because you find that, as you mentioned at some point, I think you did touch on network strength or network weakness. You find that these networks are just weak, and that actually blocks you from using these to the fullest.
Yeah, certainly that can be a big challenge, and we've seen that in places like Texas, where they've had to build a lot more transmission to address some of that. But even then, they still have concerns. Australia has done a lot of work to look at whether they need synchronous condensers at plants or in various locations, and that's been one of their solutions. There are solutions around just limiting the instantaneous penetration for certain locations as well. So Australia recently completed a study on some of these topics that's quite useful. It's called the Renewable AEMO, Australia Energy Markets Operators Renewable Integration Study. There's a lot of good information in there. We co-hosted a webcast that they talked on last week on that topic. So that topic is definitely one of the ones that's really becoming prevalent across the world, around better understanding some of these weaker parts in the network, and how we can either control the resources themselves, add additional technologies, or limit the penetration in those areas, because they will have some challenges otherwise.
Colleagues, I think we have gone just over our time, and I just want to thank yourself, Aidan, for making this possible. And as we mentioned at the beginning, we are looking forward to more interactions with you guys like this one. And I think we can close our meeting officially at this point till we meet again. Cheers, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay,
Bye.
cheers.